He only meant to fix the fence. He had no idea the woman on the other side owned half the city. The late afternoon sun pressed warm against his neck as he rotated a rusty screw with slow patience. Dirt clung to the creases of his palms, the metal taste of old nails on the air, and the slack board shivered under his hand, until, at last, it held. He glanced up. In the next yard, a pair of hands refolded a newspaper, deliberate and silent, and a shadow of a woman watched from behind tall, manicured shrubs. His daughter sat on the porch step, braid tangling with the evening breeze, chin propped on knees, sipping lukewarm lemonade from a dented cup. The smell of lemon and soap and machine oil braided together like a vow. Before we go on like this, like strangers brushing past the truth, like and subscribe, and tell us where you are watching from, because stories like this ripple farther than one neighborhood. He set down the screwdriver and called, softer than he felt he owed, "Hey, can you hear me? Is the water okay over there?" A voice from behind the glass, measured and unreadable, answered, "I can hear you. Are you finished with that plank?" He did not know then that the measured voice belonged to Evelyn Hart, whose portrait had once been printed on the local weekly with a headline about downtown redevelopment, and whose firm owned buildings with brass plaques and managers with three-piece suits. He only knew the voice had the same curiosity his daughter had, the same careful distance people keep from neighbors they think are fragile or dangerous. And he only knew his hands were tired, his rent was due, and his daughter wanted a bicycle before winter shrank the days down. He introduced himself without thinking of how the name landed differently when said in a lobby or on a mortgage document. His name was Jonah Cruz. The cup of lemonade on the step had been poured by his daughter, Mia, who hummed a tune that sounded like summer and homework rolled together. Jonah said, "You can call me Jonah. Mia says hello," and Mia waved a sticky hand. The woman behind glass lifted two fingers. The neighborhood heard the small exchange like a bell, and it set in motion something none of them saw coming. This is a story about pride and apology, and the unsteady way communities let in power, one board at a time. Jonah had hands that told the story of other things. Born in a small house 3 blocks from the river, he had learned to balance a beam with his father before he could read a map. His earliest memory was the smell of varnish and hot metal in his father's garage, a narrow room where light built ladders on the floor and ragged tools waited like old friends. He had learned to lean a ladder so it wouldn't wobble, to sand with patience, to keep promises even when parts were missing. School did not last long. The day his father died, when Jonah was 14, the estate was small and the bills were not. He left the classroom and stayed. He learned to add and subtract debt next to the sound of a radio and a wrench. He learned how to keep a daughter fed and warm and how to fold a shirt to look like new. He had 2 scars on his knuckles from a time a rusted hinge refused to bend, and a callus on his left thumb where a hammer had kissed his skin through a winter. He lived in a small house with a sagging porch and a viga in the back beam that needed replacing, but he kept a steady eye on his daughter, a quiet dignity in the way he answered morning questions, the way he set cups of lemonade down with a careful hand. On the first afternoon, the fence needed work. An accidental window opened into a life he had only read about in headlines. When Evelyn stepped into the yard, she wore a sweater the color of late fog and gloves that had never held a nail. Her shoes made a faint sound on his concrete steps. The smell of her perfume was cool and floral, like a space where nothing ever stayed dirty. Jonah wiped his hands on his jeans, and Mia ran to her with the unerring logic of children who do not yet measure people by their purses. "You have a beautiful garden," Mia announced, proud and plain. The woman smiled with a small, surprised lift to her mouth. The first encounter stretched like a string of beads, each exchange a bead polished by curiosity. There were 8 back and forths at least, the kind of talk that builds a fence out of words rather than wood. "I can fix that board if you like," Jonah offered, fingers still gritty. "You do not have to," Evelyn replied, which meant she had never asked anyone to touch her property. "My name is Jonah," he said. "Mia," the child replied, offering the cup of lemonade as if pouring peace on tension. "Evelyn," the woman said, and the name landed soft in the yard like a stone. Jonah asked about the flowers, Mia told a story about a lost bicycle, and Evelyn listened, eyes narrowing in a way that could be either kindness or calculation. "Do you know who owns the lot down on Halston?" Jonah asked, thinking of rumors and executive decisions and the way whole blocks could be bought with a single phone call. Evelyn's mouth tightened. "I do. It is complicated." They spoke about fevers, about small repairs, about the exact way paint can make a porch look like a promise kept. The sound of a distant delivery truck hummed the background into ordinariness. In the middle of this ordinary, a rumor began to breathe. They sat on mismatched chairs, Jonah with grease still on his forearms, and Evelyn with a newspaper folded like armor. There were details of smell and texture, a morning described in clanging coffee cups and the sound of a bicycle chain that had not been oiled. Jonah told a short version of how he repaired old radios on weekends for extra cash. Evelyn told nothing of firm names, just of a taste for quiet. Mia offered raisins from a tin, which Evelyn accepted with an almost ritual gratitude. The first warmth between them was small and carefully tended. It spread like lemonade diluted with a little too much water, honest and refreshing, and a little worried about what would happen when the sun set. At dinner, Jonah talked to his mother over a bad connection about the sudden presence of Evelyn. She was quiet, but she asked about the school, he said, listening to static and the night train. His mother told him to be careful. His neighbor Carl, who ran the locksmith shop 2 blocks down, waved as he passed and commented on how the wealthy do not tend to come to this street unless there is a blueprint on their minds. Lucia, the second-grade teacher at the school, later stopped by with a plate of empanadas and a question about donations for the end-of-term fair. By the time the moon rose, Evelyn had left a card with numbers and the formal title she used for meetings and the city paper. It sat on Jonah's table like a quiet bet. A week later, an envelope arrived, thick and professional, stamped with the name Hart Capital. The envelope made the house smell like money, even though none had been counted. The letter contained a brief invitation. Evelyn was hosting a neighborhood consultation at a small community room across from the bakery. Jonah considered himself modest by nature, but restless in his worries. The consultation was to discuss redevelopment on Halston Avenue, a project that, if it went forward, would alter small businesses, push rent up, and make certain porches less likely to hold families like his. There was a technical part of the letter that used words like appraisal and easement. There was also a sentence that mentioned public opinion and community benefit. Jonah felt the fence in his yard like a thin skin between his life and a corporation's appetite. The first whispers in town were slow. The bakery owner, Marta, told everyone the rumor over coffee and warm bread, her voice pressing into every corner of the shop. "They want to build luxury apartments," she said, fingering the rim of her cup. Lucia reported that the school board had been called to a meeting. Mayor Thompson read a prepared statement about growth and jobs and then took more calls than he let cross his city voicemail. The opposition had a name attached to it, Peter Lang, a man with a tie that glinted in every photograph, and a phone that never stopped ringing. He represented interests that blunted public space for private profit. Samir, the regional banker, called to remind anyone listening about fiscal responsibility. The document that had arrived on Jonah's table read like a ritual in the way it hid calculations behind polite verbs. On the night before the formal consultation, Evelyn came to Jonah's yard with a small box of pastries because Mia had been polite and asked for an autograph on a paper bicycle. Jonah and Evelyn sat on the steps and ate sugar with their fingers, light and quiet like two people who had been paired in a photograph. She confessed, in a voice closer than before, that her childhood was not gilded but guarded. She had been raised in a house of plans where kindness was measured and emotion counted as an expense. She had slowly inherited responsibility, and with it, a taste for the kind of decisions that did not show on the kitchen table. Jonah said nothing about the letter. He was more interested in whether Mia's bicycle would be fixed if he could find the parts. The consultation day smelled of coffee and nervous paper. The room was a rectangle of folding chairs and polite applause. of legal pads and hands that shook and hands that smoothed out suit jackets. Evelyn spoke first, her voice now practiced and warm. Jonah took a seat next to Rosa, his elderly neighbor who lived alone above the florist and who remembered when the street had trees that shaded the pavement. Rosa wore a scarf and the memory of other councils where promises came and went. Jonah listened as Evelyn mapped benefits and possible mitigations. Her slides were clear. She talked about affordable units and green spaces with a corporate gravity that made people breathe differently. Peter Lang sat in the corner with a planner, a man with a ledger that had been groomed to silence objections. Samir offered financing options that looked neat on paper. The room smelled like a courthouse and a coffee shop folded together. At the end of the meeting, Jonah stood to ask a question. "What happens to the small shop owners on Halston?" he asked. The room filled with a silence you could almost touch, the kind that leaves the air heavy and clumsy. Evelyn answered with a list of policy safeguards. She used the word partnership in a way that held both hope and a ledger. Rosa pressed her lips together and suggested stronger guarantees. Lucia asked about the after-school programs and how a construction schedule could disrupt children. The conversation slid into technicalities and numbers. There was, in the corners of the room, a growing doubt wrapped in polite sentences. The community wanted more than lip service. Rumors became actions. Overnight, a conservative column in the city paper questioned the allocation of tax credits. On the morning, a formal petition circulated. Jonah found his mailbox stuffed with glossy flyers that promised revitalization and a better tax base. The issue climbed like ivy and covered every telephone pole, until even Mia asked if the construction meant her school would move. Jonah felt the first prick of fear. He saw that power could hold two hands at once, one clean and one that fed its children through the other. He went to the bank to ask about small loans for materials. Samir greeted him with a warmness that had the edges of policy. They spoke in careful sentences about collateral and repayment schedules and about the irony of a city that could finance growth while squeezing out the people who gave it character. The conversation at the bank was a short, precise passage of 300 and something characters that explained regulatory approvals and easements and how a title transfer could be contested if evidence of adverse possession or covenant violations were made. It read like a manual, but the stakes felt like a window left open during a storm. Tension rose into a bruising moment when a public notice appeared, glued to the fence between Jonah's yard and Evelyn's. It declared that a preliminary survey had been authorized and that Hart Capital had filed for an easement that could alter the lot lines on Halston. People gathered. They read it out loud, in the same way prayers are recited, with a mix of hope and dread. Jonah walked down the block and found Carl and Marta and Lucia and Rosa already talking in a circle. Names formed into a chorus. Jonah, Mia, Evelyn, Peter, Samir, Mayor Thompson, Maria from the corner store, and old Mr. Gaines, who still fixed bicycles in his shed. Each person pushed the story in their own way. Explosive accusations surfaced, and then the town had its first public argument. The first confrontation in the council chamber was blunt. Peter Lang stood at the microphone and read pages of fiscal projections that smelled of numbers and certainty. Evelyn took the podium and spoke of reinvestment and community benefit. Jonah watched Evelyn's face while she spoke, looking for slippage, for the private cost behind the transforms. He felt a strange fracture. Half the community had already placed Evelyn on the pedestal for having resources, but the rest saw a corporate hand poised above their porches with a legal brush ready to sweep away their lives. The arguments spiraled. Jonah heard himself stand and tell his story, and his voice cracked like old wood. He described his father, his Vega, his need to keep a roof over Mia's head. He told the council about nights counting pennies and the dignity in small, honest work. The chamber listened, some with wet eyes, some with folded arms. One of the moments of tension pushed for space in time. Jonah received a late-night summons to Hart Capital. The elevator smelled of lemon polish and synthetic upholstery. He entered a room with a long table where men in suits sat like judges. They had documents with signatures and the air of inevitability. "We can offer relocation assistance," they said. Jonah asked what that meant. The question loosened the room. They replied with numbers and conditions, and the sound felt like a verdict. Jonah thought of Mia and the way she clutched at a picture book that had pages frayed from love. He felt the ledger tilt. The community outside beat on windows and called for a pause. Inside, decisions were threaded through waxed sentences. The moment lasted long enough that Jonah could name each stitch in his own chest. He left the office with a brochure and a polite reminder of deadlines. The downtown lights blurred as he crossed the street. Another peak of tension crackled in the square when a piece of Evelyn's past was published in the weekly. A former partner accused Hart Capital of pushing out small proprietors in other neighborhoods, and evidence suggested that affordable units promised often became luxury condos before rabbits could be counted in the hat. This revelation landed in the town like a stone in a pond and made rings that reached every porch. Evelyn convened a meeting at the florist where Rosa laid out tea with trembling hands. They argued. She defended her record. Jonah watched with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity, not ready to believe treachery in the person who had once handed Mia a pastry, but not ready to dismiss the weight of what was published. Evelyn's voice became human and sharp and full of apology, and for the first time she let the curtain drop a little on the mechanism of her life. The break came when a survey crew arrived to measure property lines, and a heavy truck rolled onto the lot next to Jonah's. That truck was a machine with an appetite. It boomed and dug and left a smell of diesel and new earth. The community assembled, and a heated argument unfolded that had 500+ characters of raw feeling stitched into the air. Jonah stepped between men with clipboards and residents with placards. He and Evelyn found themselves on opposite sides of a police barrier, voices raised in the best way people can when fear tries to flatten dignity. "You promised compensation," Jonah said. "I promised community reinvestment," Evelyn replied. The words collided and left small splinters in their meaning. The crowd chanted and countered, and the council had to call a brief recess. The local reporters snapped pictures, and the bakery's bell rang with a mournful tinkle. The scene had the cadence of an old sorrow wearing new clothes. After the public fight, trust broke. Jonah felt as if a plank of the fence had been replaced with a sheet of translucent plastic that only pretended to hold. The community questioned Evelyn. She received letters, some scrawled with hatred and some with cautious hope. Jonah received offers from lawyers who smelled possibility like open wounds. The conflict spread into dinner tables and PTA meetings in the council. Same way a cold spreads in winter. Jonah and Evelyn avoided each other for days, slipping past windows and hedges, until Mia, with the bluntness of a child, left a paper bicycle at Evelyn's gate. The paper bicycle had been drawn in crayon and declared, by Mia's fierce logic, a peace offering. Evelyn saw it, and for a long moment the city maps and the spreadsheets did not seem to matter. She stepped out and knocked on Jonah's door. Their conversation began with a small forgiveness. "I did not know the way it looks to you," she said, voice raw with the unfamiliarity of confession. Jonah, tired and stubborn, answered with a guarded honesty. The dialogue expanded into more than 10 exchanges, each sentence a careful paring down of suspicion. She explained the board meetings, the pressure from investors, the cold language of quarterly goals. He explained the ledger of a family's small life, the nights when the heater failed, and the math of how far a week's wages could stretch. They traded examples, they traded stories. She told of an uncle who had left a Vega in a shed to rot under neglect. He told of a father who had taught him to hammer without anger. They began to build a shared language. Evelyn made a decision that was small and seismic. She called a private board meeting and proposed an amendment to the development plan that would legally require a higher percentage of permanently affordable units and a guarantee for displaced small businesses to receive priority leasing at below-market rates for a period. She drafted language that was legally binding and plausible, and then she offered her own income stream as collateral for a small community trust to assist displaced proprietors. The steps she outlined were technical and specific. A transfer of capital into an escrow fund would occur upon reaching certain construction milestones. The process required a set of signatures and an agreement with the city council to enforce the covenants. The explanation of the mechanism took about 300 characters and read like a recipe, clear and insistently hopeful. It was a gesture with teeth. The town received the news with a mixture of relief and cynicism. Some saw it as a public relations bandage. Others, like Rosa and Marta and Lucia, accepted the gesture with cautious joy. The council held a special session. Peter Lang frowned and questioned the sustainability of the plan. Samir offered to provide transparent audits. The community demanded terms. Jonah watched Evelyn present the amended plan in public. She did not stand behind charts alone. She brought forward names and signatures and a small binding trust that would be administered by a local board, including Rosa and Lucia and a representative from the school. She seemed smaller in the presence of the people and larger in the presence of her own courage. The repair of trust did not happen all at once. It happened in small things that were heavy. Evelyn showed up at Jonah's workshop and asked to learn how to plane a board. She smelled of perfumes and paperwork, and the wood sawdust caught in the crook of her elbow. Jonah warned her about safety and showed her how to hold the tool and to listen, really listen, to the wood. Mia sat on a stool and watched, wide-eyed. They broke bread with Marta, who baked an extra pastry. Carl fixed the lock on Hart Capital's delivery gate without charging because he believed in stitches more than invoices. The neighborhood declared an impromptu festival to celebrate the amending of the plan, and the small trust was publicized in a paper with a headline that tried to be balanced. The party was the proof of a new weather in town, a small festival full of light and clumsy joy that smelled of roasted corn and lemonade. There were swings, and someone had painted a mural on the wall that showed children riding a bicycle together. Jonah watched Mia laugh with other kids, and he felt the impossible weight of being allowed to breathe. Evelyn, standing nearby, held a paper cup and clapped for the puppet show that the school had put on. The band played a tune that made people cross their arms and sway. Personal lines blurred. Peter Lang, who had spent months arguing numbers, accepted a pastry and confessed he had a niece who loved paper boats. The community sang, slow and imperfect, until the sun went down. Afterwards, they did the work that actually makes things last. A committee made up of local shop owners, residents, and Hart Capital representatives was formed to oversee the trust and manage leases. They wrote covenants that bound developers to keep a percentage of units affordable, and they wrote a clause that gave small business owners first rights to reopen for a period of time after construction. They arranged job training with the school so residents could get work on site if they wanted. The work was slow and technical and irregular. The law firm drafted protections. The city clerk recorded amendments. The escrow account received its first deposit. The technical description of the escrow and covenant process was explained to residents in plain language and then again with legal precision so both Harts and Files could agree on the future. Trust moved from a headline to a ledger. Months later, an opening appeared in the lot where the Vega had been replaced, and there were foundations and plans of a park and a small space allocated for a community workshop where Jonah could rent a bench at reduced cost. Evelyn arranged for the first month of rent to be waived and for materials at a discount as a down payment toward giving back to the neighborhood. The shop windows reflected a new light. People began to walk their routes as if trying on a new habit. Jonah felt the town breathing differently, like a chest learning to expand after being constricted. The repair of more than wood had started. 1 month later, the street smelled like fresh concrete and rosemary. Jonah had received an offer to teach a weekend class at the new community workshop on basic carpentry. He took it. He walked the block, and there were flyers about job training and a small board listing open shifts for local hires during construction. Mia rode a borrowed bicycle with training wheels at the park, and her laugh sounded like a declaration. Evelyn visited the school and read to a group of second graders about a building that should belong to the people who loved it. They had their picture taken, and the city paper ran a small column about partnership and trust. People still argued in the comment threads under the article. The bank fees still existed, but the work of mending had started. 3 months later, the scaffolding had grown taller and the foundation poured deeper. Jonah had a small list of students who came faithfully to his workshops. He taught them to sand and to measure and to stand proud of their hands. A new small bakery opened its doors with a sign painted by Lucia. Mr. Gaines had set up a little repair station for bicycles and taught children to oil chains properly. The trust had been audited, and the report read like a ledger that had learned to care. Evelyn had begun a scholarship for a high schooler interested in urban planning to study locally and then return to help the community nurture the space they had won. Jonah and Evelyn were no longer strangers. They traded stories about the best way to sand a board and about which pavement tree had the most shade. There was coffee and debate and laughter that tasted like real repair. 6 months later, the lot had sprouted green roofs and small storefronts and a little lane where vendors sold lemonade on hot days. The permanent affordable units were occupied by people who had lived in the neighborhood for years. The small bakery had a new oven. The children rode their bicycles down the newly painted lane every Sunday. Mayor Thompson cited the development as a case study in public-private partnership that worked, though he kept his speech careful. Peter Lang had left the firm by then, quoted as moving on to other ventures that required less heart and more numbers. Jonah had registered his small workshop as a community hub and held a celebration where he gave Mia a real bicycle with a bell that rang like a small promise. Evelyn sat in the front row and clapped the loudest. The town learned how to keep its watchfulness without sliding into cynicism. It learned slow rules about how power could be held accountable and how community could require more than polite words. In the end, the fence between Jonah and Evelyn became less a divider and more a marker of what they had won. Rebuilt together. The viga in Jonah's back beam was finally replaced with a stronger piece of timber, plans approved and paid for in part by the trust. He knew the math of how that had happened, the signatures and escrow and the transfer lines in legal documents. He also knew the way Mia would run to the workshop and press her face to the wood shavings and laugh. He had learned that dignity could be bought in small measures and earned in greater ones. Evelyn had not bought their love or their gratitude. She had offered structures that made dispossession less likely and taken on the public view of accountability. They both had bruises along the way, and both had reasons to be cautious. There were nights they still argued about the pace of change and about the best way to teach a child to be proud of work that wears your hands. But the argument now had a foundation. If this story leaves you with something, let it be a small truth, that people with different resources can find a way to weave their lives together without one unraveling the other. If this story reached you, if the bridge between neighborhoods and power and love matters to you, subscribe and tell us in the comments what small act changed your life. The fence mended, the workshop full, the bicycle bell ringing every Sunday. 1 month later, the first boxes were being labeled, and Jonah's sign rested on the window reading, "Community Workshop." The little trust had paid for a bench and a set of communal tools. Mia rode circles around the park with a grin that could rewrite a calendar. The neighborhood fair had more stalls, and the school reported an uptick in participation. Evelyn sat in on Jonah's first public class and listened as he explained how to choose the right nail for a plank and how to listen to the wood before you decide which tool to use. Their conversation after class was quiet and human, and both left feeling like they had earned the day. 3 months on, the scaffolds rose higher, and the small storefronts lined the new lane with hand-painted signs. The bakery had hired 2 locals who had been out of work for months. Rosa had a new lemon tree planted outside her door and tended it like a possessed gardener. Jonah had a calendar full of weekend apprentices and a waiting list. Evelyn walked the lane at dusk, looking at the lights, and sometimes she would pause and talk to the people on benches, learning the local names and stories. The council had passed new regulations preventing rapid conversions of promised affordable units, and the trust had its first independent audit. The town began to feel like a community that had defended itself well enough to be hopeful. 6 months after the first plank was hammered into place, the lane had become a habit. Children played until late, and shop windows glowed with personal touches. Jonah had enough steady work to imagine a better calendar and a fuller cupboard. Mia rode each Sunday at the head of a small procession of children, their bells chiming and their laughter announcing a changed rhythm. Evelyn stood at the doorway of the bakery and bought a pastry and handed it to a man who could not afford it, an old habit learning new muscles. They had not solved every problem. Rents in other neighborhoods still climbed, and other streets still feared new trucks. But here the community had found a method for holding power accountable, and they had done it with small daily acts. Tables set for neighbors, classes that taught hands how to craft, covenants that were more than words, and a trust that began to feel less like a legal novelty and more like a neighborly promise. If you watched until the end, tell us what small kindness changed your own street and where you were watching from.